everyone. This is edition 1873 of your newspaper. Steve's here. Charlie's here.
Yep. Hello.
And Buddy's in the corner. No, Buddy's over there. Now, my subject today is the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. And when we were in the car, Charlie told me why you couldn't dive in it. Tell me again, Charlie.
Well, when we went swimming when I was a kid, I in the 50s and the early 60s.
Which bit of it was? Which bit of
the
it
old
was
Roan
it?
Aintree.
The old Roan, yeah.
By the racecourse, behind the racecourse.
Yes.
We used to go swimming there, but you couldn't dive in or jump in because you were in danger of impaling yourself on an old bike frame.
How deep do you reckon it was, Charlie?
Well, at the edges it was probably about 3 foot deep, and it went to about 4 to 4.5 feet. It would come up to your chest when you're a kid. So yeah, you had to stand on tiptoes if you were.
The water was grey grim, was it?
Oh no, it was it was fine. It was clean water. I don't ever remember anybody catching anything horrible off it. You know,
because they didn't flow, did they? I mean, there was no current.
No.
Just flat water.
Well, they would have flowed from lock to lock.
Oh yes. Now the locks. That's another question. Now there are 91 locks on the canal. It's 127 miles long. Now I'm going to explain a lock, and if I get it wrong, Charlie will take over. Basically,
you won't get it right.
There's 400. The one thing this canal had to do was to get over the Pennines. So its highest point is 460 feet above sea level. Now, you can't have canals going uphill for obvious reasons with water. So what happens is, your boat's in a kind of box, you go into a closed gate, then you're raised up by the water level to the height of to the level of the next bit, and then you carry on. So that bit empties again, then you move forward onto the next stretch of the canal. Now, not all of the locks had keepers, so sometimes you'd have to get out and you would have to manage the locks yourself. So it was quite a journey. It would have been quite a journey to take. Nonetheless, it was still better than just horses and carts. And when you consider how bad the road system was in the 18th century, it was considered to be the best method. Now, the oldest canal in this country is the Bridgewater Canal, built by James Brinley for Francis Egerton, 3rd Duke of Bridgewater, from Worsley to Manchester, 1759. Now, the Leeds-Liverpool Canal is only 15 years after that. And when you consider that the Bridgewater is famous and it's only, 8 or 9 miles long, the Leeds-Liverpool, in the end, and it is a very long project, is 127 miles. Mm. And the other thing is, it was only finished 10 years ago. Because it was only in 2009 when the final Liverpool section was open, bringing it to the waterfront. So I've not been on it since, but so you can go past the waterfront buildings and so on into the Albert Dock system. So it's quite a project, this. Now, the Industrial Revolution, simple enough, turns things from a cottage industry. Let's talk about, say, spinning. A cottage, a family would have a spinning wheel. Children would help when they were at home, a few hours, but it was home-based to some extent. Industrial Revolution meant that machinery could do the jobs of 1, 2, 4 or 6 people. There were more production line elements in it. There were things that were invented which meant that factories were needed, central places where people worked from the age of maybe 6 or 8. And of course, I'm sure you all know, they were dreadful conditions. Unless you legislate, and they didn't do so until 1833, you will not get the majority of employers to behave reasonably to their people. There are some who did, I'm sure, but in general terms, without the law, it's not likely to happen. So, the people, the first generation who were in the Industrial Revolution, suffered greatly. It may well be that their grandchildren were better off, and more people moved to the towns and so on, the old mill towns or whatever, but originally it imposed a very harsh system, and the canals were to move goods, especially coal, which was very much needed. We still don't have the steamships, but coal was becoming a commodity of need in the 18th century. The impetus for this project comes actually from the town of Bradford, which was becoming an important textile town in the 1750s and 60s. They had good links with the Humber, the 5 rivers that go into the Humber, including the Ouse. They had good links with the east, but they wanted the west coast. And that's Liverpool, that's us. And Liverpool, as you know from my other talks, was deeply involved in the slave trade, but also there were many other trades as well. And it was the main embarkation port taken over from Hull for the north of England for all products. And textiles were coming, cotton was coming in from the what later became the United States, and textiles were coming out of Yorkshire and Lancashire and being exported. And say coal and limestone were also being used. There were massive building projects in Liverpool starting, docks and so on. So they wanted to move stuff around, and they believed that because of the Bridgewater, canals would be the best way forward. Now, so what happens then is as I say, it's Bradford that is the main beginner, and they call a meeting. They are inspired, as I say, by the Bridgewater and James Brinley, and they have a meeting at the Sun Inn in Bradford, 2nd of July 1766, and they ask an engineer, a river engineer from the River Ouse, John Longbottom, if he will survey the route. Now this was a big part of these projects. What you would do, you'd walk the route with a team, you'd work out the best way to get from A to B, the cheapest way, the way where you wouldn't need as much high and low as other routes, so that your lock system might be less, how you could bypass areas where the landlords didn't give you permission, which of course they didn't have to, and some of them didn't. We'll come to that later. And then a later part of the project was, if you've got to go 50 feet up to get over a high spot, to get over a hill, would it be possible to tunnel your way under it? And we also come to that as well. So there are tunnels on this project, as well as the 91 locks. So it was then decided to form committees, canal committees, in all the different towns en route. And Longbottom came forward with a route, with a surveyed route, and all the maps, what they call a prospectus, where they show the subscribers what they are going to do. And guess what? Liverpool didn't like the route. The route went through the Ribble Valley and through Preston. And according to Liverpool, it was too far north. They wanted to bring the canal via Wigan, because Liverpool at this point was using the Wigan coalfields, and they wanted a link between them and Liverpool. There was a thing called the Douglas Navigation, which was mostly natural but partially man-made, which they were considering not to be useful anymore and not to be of practical use. So they came up, Liverpool's committee came up with a counter proposal. A man called John Eyes. And John Eyes was the person who produced the first map of Liverpool. So I know about him. A man called Richard Mullin, who I don't know much about, and a man, one of the Molyneux family. That would have been useful. Because if you had the landlords on your side, well, that was made things less complicated, especially when you had to negotiate bringing your canal through their land. So the argument would be, yeah, okay, you bring it through my land, but what benefit is there for me? Oh yeah, but you can load your stuff on. So it was a kind of argument about benefits and cost. A man called Pages Burdett then improved the Liverpool scheme, but then the Bradford Committee rejected the Liverpool scheme because it was too expensive, and they objected to the amount of money that it would have been to cross the Ribble or Burnley Valley. Well, there was a deadlock because of the two committees, so they brought in James Brinley, the influential engineer of the Bridgewater Canal, to arbitrate between the disputations between the different canal committees. They preferred Longbottom's northern scheme. Liverpool was in a sulk, and some of the North Lancashire investors dropped out. But then there was a compromise. They agreed that the main line would stay as it was, but they would also build branch lines into various needy points. And there are at least a dozen branches off the Liverpool Canal, and I probably missed a few, but there are at least a dozen. And that was brought in as a compromise to keep everybody on side. In 1768, James Brinley estimated the route as 109 miles and a cost of £259,977, about £35 million today.
That's cheap, that.
Now, that route ends up being 18 miles longer in the end, and that was because of people on the routes objecting, which meant that certain small changes had to be made in the canal to bypass or go round. For instance, the town of Accrington was missed out because a landlord, the Peel family, didn't want anything to do with it. It was a very, very difficult project. Now, what you also then had to do, you had to get an Act of Parliament to agree to build your canal. And the first Act was passed May 1770. Everything needed an Act of Parliament in those days, as I've said before. And the other thing is, if you then departed from it or made small changes pursuant unto the Act, you couldn't. You then had to have another Act of Parliament so that you could then bring in any new changes. So we end up with 4 different Acts of Parliament connected with this canal. So Brinley was in charge, and Longbottom, who had made the original survey, was appointed as his clerk of works. I've been told that many jobs fail today because we don't have good clerks of works anymore. They were the people who went out and looked at the job first to decide how it would be, what the way forward would be. And I heard a thing on the radio where it said that many authorities no longer have people who decide upon a job before it actually gets decided upon, if you see what I mean. So, Brinley died in 1772, and Longbottom was taken on both roles, engineer and clerk of works. Now, I ought to warn you that this canal does kill a lot of engineers, but it does go on for a very long time. So, on the 5th of November 1770, there was a commencement ceremony, or what we would call today a foundation stone laying, at Househall near Preston. Or is it nearer to Ormskirk, Charlie?
It's nearer to Ormskirk,
Nearer to Ormskirk, isn't it? Househall. where the first sod, as in the ground,
Yeah.
we're not being insulting, was cut by Sir Charles Mordaunt. Now Mordaunt had been very influential in persuading other local landlords to accept the canal. So he got the job of cutting the first sod. And it wasn't something where you built it from one end to the other. Oh no. It was built in sections. And they didn't join at all. In fact, sometimes they were 60 or 70 miles apart. And in general, there was more progress on the Yorkshire side than there was on Lancashire. Because they were the ones who wanted to move the stuff. So the first section, Bingley to Skipton, was opened in 1773. 1774, the Shipley was added, again on the Yorkshire side. And then there was a very influential Five Rise Lock branch built, where they had to get a lot of height in a short distance. And these individual projects, which had been estimated as part of the cost, there's nothing different then than there is now. They always went way beyond budget. Everything to do with this canal ends up being much more expensive. What's new? There was also a seven arch viaduct over a small Yorkshire river, which name I have forgotten. But it was a massive 7-arch viaduct, and that was to take the canal above the river. So you had to build the whole structure, like the kind of canal that you would normally be on would be taken above the river, taken across it, and that again would add a huge amount to your costs. In 1881, the Liverpool part of the canal reached Wigan, which is what they really wanted to do anyway, because they could then stop using the old Douglas navigation and they could bring their coal into Liverpool, which is what they wanted. There was a huge row about Wigan overcharging, which I'll not go into, but it was immense, went on for years. Anyway, by 1781, all of the funds were gone. Everything that had been subscribed had gone. There was no money left. There was also a war with America, which was going very badly wrong, and we were about to lose. Trade with the American colonies had almost ceased. I say almost. They could borrow no more money either, because the interest rates were too high. Work stopped completely. Nothing happened on the canal. They lost complete impetus. The committees disbanded, and nothing happened for 8 years until 1789, when another engineer called Robert Whitworth came forward with proposals to continue the canal and to join some of its existing sections. And he was the one who suggested that rather than go up high above sea level, which they had to do, he was the one that suggested tunnels. Now, I don't know whether this was the case with these canal tunnels, but I did have a programme on the TV, and it was one of the Brunel tunnels. It's not one of ours, so it's much later. But there was a guy moving his feet along the wall. Have you seen that,
Yes.
guy, where they moved their feet on the wall, didn't they?
They got a guy either side, and
And they moved themselves along the tunnel by actually
walking.
walking along the side walls. Now, I'm not sure whether they had to do this with our tunnels. They probably did. I suppose ropes might have been used, but I'm not sure. But this Whitworth proposal suggested that there should be tunnels. And he made major changes on the Lancashire side of the route. Now, that meant that a new Act of Parliament was needed. So there's the second Act of Parliament that we've come to. Then there was more fundraising, where you said to people, look, you give us 10,000 now, and you'll make 13,000 in 15 or 20 years' time. And very seldom they did, by the way. But because, as I say, usually they were overtaken by events. However, the profit would be made in other ways, finally, when they were able to move goods. So, coal was still the main cargo. And the route was slowly moving towards the one which Liverpool had originally chosen, and which their engineer, Pages Badet, sometimes written as Paget Badet, but I think it's Pages, which was the one that he had originally suggested. Now we come to the Foul Ridge Tunnel, and I don't really know where this is, but this was one of the big projects. I think it's the Lancashire side, but this is one of the big projects, and it was way beyond budget, and it was caused when the Peel family refused permission for the canal to go over this land, so that Accrington was bypassed. This tunnel was 1,640 yards long, just under a mile, and it was a massive project. It opened in 1796. There was also a 7-lock system at Barrowford, which was another expensive project that they didn't expect to occur. The final cost of the Foul Ridge Tunnel was £40,000, which was essentially the most expensive of the several separate projects, which in the end become part of the canal. Another one was the Calder Valley, which was a great problem to them, where they built a 60-foot high embankment with all the stone and all the riveting, everything that it needed, to carry the canal across the Calder. The cost of that project added another £22,000 to the project, and added another 5 years to the project. Whitworth was exhausted by this, and when his wife was asked what had killed him, she said, "I don't know the actual cause, but in my view and my family's view, it was the Calder embankment." Very interesting. Samuel Fletcher was appointed. What used to happen, again, was that people who'd worked on the canal, either as clerk of works or senior canal manager, would be the ones who'd be appointed to the next vacancy as engineer. Samuel Fletcher was, Whitworth was 64 when he died, I should say, 1799, and Samuel Fletcher was appointed to continue the work. Now, while I was talking, Charlie's looked up this tunnel. Where is it? The Foul Ridge Tunnel, Charlie?
The Foul Ridge Tunnel was made the canal navigable from Leeds to Burnley.
Yeah, this is this Burnley Valley project.
Yeah.
And we've got all the facts right according to this. But there was one thing, there's two things that were not on my list. One, another Act of Parliament, which I'd missed. Now this one was to allow borrowing. Well, what happens to allow the selling of shares? Now what you do, if you change the nature of the company into what's known as a debenture holding company, into a shares, what they would say today would be going on the stock exchange, but it'd be different now, then you've got to get permission to do that as well. But what they also had to do, they could sell shares for, I think it was 280,000,
yeah.
But they also had to pay 101,000 back from what they'd originally borrowed under the previous Act of Parliament. Now, in this piece, read that bit about why this tunnel's become famous now, Charlie. I'd not heard this.
The Foul Ridge Tunnel was a major construction achievement, but today it's best known for the story of a cow that once swam the whole length of the tunnel, which is a mile and a bit.
That's not bad, is it? I bet you it was probably trying to escape the burger factory.
It probably fell off the off one of the barges and
They
had
were
to
probably
swim.
trying to escape our Reed sausage factory in Salford or wherever it was. Anyway, that's great. It is marvellous the way you can look things up now. So, Fletcher had taken over after Whitworth had died. And we were now 1800. So we're now, 30 years after the original cutting of the first sod. So again, there was another stoppage in work because borrowing was difficult, because there'd been a peace treaty with France, and then everybody was thinking that's all right. But after another year, the whole war started again. So there was a stoppage again. Then Samuel Fletcher died, another engineer killed by the canal, they said, and his brother Joseph and Joseph's son James were then jointly appointed to continue. The costs were continuing to rise. More industrialists were demanding branches. One of the branches cost an extra, in our money, £36 million. By 1816, you could travel the full, what it was in the end, finally, 127 miles of the canal, as I said, which was, in fact, 46 years after the original start of the construction. There was also a connection with the Bridgewater Canal, which gave Manchester access to the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. Now, as well as this, there were other companies all over the north of England building other canals. Rochdale, Bury, Bolton, and another town which I can't remember. But there were canal projects now everywhere. By 1816, remember, we were only 9 years away from the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and only 14 years away from the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, which to some extent made canals redundant, although because of the carriage of coal and stone, and because of the amount that they could carry compared with the railway wagons, they still managed to hang on for that reason alone. James Fletcher died still as the engineer in 1844, and the canal continued trading way into the 19th century, and also saw a renaissance of trade before the First World War as well. The Manchester Ship Canal opened in 1894, known as the Big Ship Canal, which is a completely different project though, and it does deserve for me to talk about it at some point. That caused huge problems between our buddies on me, Nick. That caused huge problems between Liverpool and Manchester, because Manchester believed that Liverpool was overcharging them for goods traffic.
That's unusual,
And
isn't it?
Manchester was convinced that we were doing them out of money. And so the Act of Parliament for the Ship Canal came as an Act of Parliament which the Liverpool MPs opposed. But by 1894, from a Westminster and a political point of view, buddies on me knee on the table, from 1894, what's interesting about that is, although Liverpool's members of Parliament opposed the Manchester demand for a canal and a bill in Parliament, their demands succeeded. And it does prove to us from a political point of view that by the 1890s, Manchester's influence at Westminster was becoming much more significant, and to some extent was more significant than Liverpool's political interest by then. The balance of power was changing. And we remember 2 weeks ago when we talked about Manchester not having an MP at all, when we were talking about Peterloo. And so 1890s, Manchester was also, they wouldn't have used the phrase, but was also starting to be considered as what today they might call a powerhouse of the North. Now, the First World War gave the Leeds-Liverpool Canal a new impetus for the movement of goods again. During the Second World War, there was severe bomb damage. A landmine at Bootle closed the canal, and defensive works were put onto the canal, tank traps and bunkers and pillboxes. I was taken to a pillbox about 10 or 15 years ago at Waterloo, or somewhere around that area, because a famous murder, not a famous, but a horrible, rather nasty murder had taken place there, which I'll not go into today. But these were built along the whole of the canal's length, but every 2.5 to 3 miles or so, because obviously these canals would have been considered as they were often called, the motorways before motorways were invented. So trade continued, first in coal and then in grain, and there was still, mostly in Yorkshire, there was still some grain being carried on the canal into the 1970s. But by then, it was becoming more of the leisure trade. Charlie's just told me about the tunnel being open to canoes, the Fowleridge Tunnel, and it was becoming more of the leisure trade. There's a book by a young man, I read it many years ago. I can't remember his name now. And this young man was obsessed with the canal and with the people who worked the canal, the people who gained their livelihood from it. And he was in a care home. He was always in care homes. His family had broken up. And he continually escapes from these homes. They're not all bad. Some of them are good and some of them not. And he always goes back to the canal. And of course the police always knew where he was and went to pick him up again. And this canal community became very important and self-contained. This shows itself as well. There's another book about the Ellesmere Port narrowboat community. Many of them came from the Wolverhampton area in the 1830s and 40s. And they became quite a separate community. And it's a kind of version of the Silk Road in the sense that nobody travelled the whole length of it. So if you were moving stuff, you might take it from, say, Lock 7 to Lock 14 or whatever, and then somebody else might take it to Lock 23. In the Wikipedia article on the canal, there is a remarkable travelogue which covers all 91 locks and takes you exactly through all of the 91 locks. I have not used that for this article because it's very specialist, but it would enable you to plan a route as far as you were able. It is a remarkable piece of work. And so this community became deeply attached to the canal and were so until the early 1970s. Now, as Liverpool became a leisure industry, as it started to attract visitors, the early 1990s, the city breaks, the tourists, the idea of the improvements to the waterfront, the rededication of dock warehouses to leisure activity, then became the idea of actually doing what the canal never did. In the 19th century, they were too busy. They never wanted to bring it any nearer than it was. They didn't need to. But the impetus in this new project, which cost £20 million, obviously in today's money, was, as I said before, to bring the canal link right in to the Albert Dock system. And it was opened on the 25th of March in 2009. One of the other aspects of the canal which I wanted to mention was the mythical Wigan Pier, which was mentioned by many music hall acts, but principally by one of the people who mentioned it was the man I talked about a month ago, George Formby. All it was was a loading jetty at Wigan for the Liverpool and Leeds Canal. However, this loading point became famous, and of course the people of Wigan, kind of in a grim sort of comedy way, enjoyed these continuous references to Wigan Pier. George Orwell, wrote a book in the 1930s, The Road to Wigan Pier, which principally describes the lives of the textile workers and mill workers and coal miners on the Wigan and Lancashire coalfield. As I mentioned before, the age of rail and steam to some extent did affect the canals, but by the 19th century you could describe there was a network of canals which had really covered the whole of the country. Shropshire Union, Grand Union, that was the one which meant that you could almost cross from the east to the west coast of Scotland. And these engineers also became famous because they would then extend this, what you might call, canal empire to other countries, and they would then do everywhere else what they had done in England, in the same way that they did with railways a generation later. Now, when we come to the railway age, we come to another interesting point which had also happened in the canal age. Do you remember when I said about Charles Morden cutting the first sod because he had persuaded a few landlords to accept the canal and allow it to cross their land? Well, in the railway age, for instance, it was even more blatant, because the Marquis of Stafford had been one of the main opponents of the first Liverpool to Manchester railway bill, and they had exactly the same procedures to go through, surveys, bills, all that, in the 1820s. So Stafford had been one of the main opponents, but he wasn't one of the main opponents when the bill came up for a second time. We now know why. He'd been given £10,000 free shares in the company. So there's nothing new, ladies and gentlemen. You could buy your way around anything, and possibly did so. And so these questions of getting around your parliamentary obstacles were dealt with in the 18th and 19th century in the same way as they did become later. Liverpool's view on the matter, when they were asked later on, they came up with a rather new theory. In the 1850s, a book was published in Liverpool which claimed that what was supposed to happen was that Liverpool was supposed to pay money so that the Leeds end of the canal could be finished. Now remember, it wasn't Leeds originally, it was Bradford. And it was only after a couple of years that the connection into the Leeds town centre and the Leeds Cloth Hall was established. Now the idea was that Liverpool was supposed to help Leeds to pay for their connection, and then Leeds was supposed to help us to finish the canal on our side of the river. That was the explanation in this book in the 1950s as to why it had taken, or it was going to take, until the 21st century until the Liverpool end of the canal was finished. Well, it might be true, but really it was the growth of the leisure industry which probably was the impetus for the extension. Over the years, the canal has been closed at various points, sometimes, whether it be damage or water draining from the canal, which was a serious problem on several occasions. But in general terms, after a few months, attempts have been made to establish the full length of the canal. In the 1880s, there was a sporting event where they had a walking race from one end of the canal to the other. And on one of these races, there were over 2,000 competitors. And these walking races, in Victorian terms, were immense. So they would go on for 6 days, and you could stop when you wanted and sleep when you wanted, your judgment, and at the end of the 6 days, the winner would be the person who, by whatever means, as long as it was walking, had achieved the most mileage. And you would just go from one end of the canal to the other for as many times as you could. And needless to say, at every important crossing point and every important point, there was a pub. There was on the ship canal as well. So this walking race became massively popular, and well, these events were extraordinary. They call them wobbles, or sometimes they call them that. And as I say, they attracted huge numbers of people. The other thing, of course, is the canal turn, which appears very obviously as one of Ainsley Racecourse's main obstacles, shall we say. I think it's the 9th fence, I think.
Yes.
And it became one of the main obstacles and still is. Although I did note recently there has been talk of reducing some of the obstacles again. So there you are, a mighty project. Whether it was the most important project round here, I'm not sure. It was certainly the longest, and indeed the most tortuous, and got rid of most engineers. But by its sheer scale, and the challenges it had to face, and the fact that most of it was done by an army of people with their hands, with their bare hands, hardly with any machinery at all, it is, I think, one of the most astonishing projects in the history of British engineering. Well, there you are. I think we might be a bit short this week, but never mind, everyone, we've finished. That's it. So we'll say thank you very much. We'll return in a couple of weeks, and thank Charlie for Googling bits of the canal.
My pleasure.
And we enjoyed that, and it's a wonderful thing that we can all do that now. And thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye, everyone.
For the week ending Saturday 16th of February, edition 1873. Our team this evening are myself, Claire, Alex, Christina and Lynn. Our technician is Mike. Sunrise at 7:30 a.m. with sunset at 5:20 p.m. There is no traffic news to report this week, however you can contact Mersey Travel on 0151 330 1000 for any travel information. I'll pass you over now to Lynn for our first news item.